She had 30 seconds to humiliate him in front of his own daughter, and she took every single one. A billionaire walked into a dying cafe expecting to find a failure. What she found instead was a single father who refused to fight back, a little girl shaking behind his legs, and a lie about to collapse. Before this story ends, an empire gets shattered, and a man with nothing gets everything he never asked for. Stay until the end, hit like, and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The bell above the door of Maple and Vine Café gave a small, tired jingle, the same sound it had made every morning for 11 years. Dylan Carter didn't even look up. He was on his knees behind the counter, wrist deep in the guts of an espresso machine that had been groaning like a dying animal since 6 a.m. And he had exactly 4 minutes before the breakfast rush hit, and customers started asking why their lattes tasted like burnt rubber. Dad? He glanced sideways. His daughter, Lily, 6 years old, dark curls escaping from a lopsided ponytail, was sitting on an overturned milk crate with a coloring book balanced on her knees. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was supposed to be at the after-school program 2 blocks down, but the program had called yesterday to say they were short-staffed and closing early for the week, and Dylan didn't have anyone else to call, so she came to work with him, like she had 100 times before. Yeah, baby? Is the coffee machine sick? Dylan almost laughed. Almost. Something like that. Will it get better? He looked at the tangle of wires and the cracked gasket in his palm, the one he'd already replaced twice this month, and he thought about the part order sitting in his email that he hadn't placed because there wasn't money for it yet. Not this week. Maybe not next week either. I'm going to try real hard to fix it, he said, which wasn't a lie, but wasn't quite the truth either. Across the cafe, behind the register, Marisol Vega was untying her apron with shaking hands. She was 19, the youngest employee Dylan had, and she'd been late twice this month because her car kept breaking down, and she couldn't afford to fix that either. Dylan had covered her shifts without telling the owner. He'd also slipped her $40 last week for gas, folded into a napkin so it wouldn't look like charity. Dylan, she said, voice low. The email came back. From corporate. He stood up too fast and felt his knee crack. What email? The inspection. They moved it up. It's today. She swallowed. Like, in 20 minutes. For a second, the whole cafe seemed to hold its breath. Maple and Vine wasn't owned by some faceless company. It belonged to an old man named Walter Higgins, 71 years old, who had run this place since before Dylan was born, who had given Dylan a job 4 years ago when nobody else would because Dylan had a baby and a resume with too many gaps in it. But 6 months ago, Walter had taken out a loan to cover renovations he never got to finish, and the loan had come from a financial group owned by Ashford Holdings, and Ashford Holdings sent people. Inspectors. Men in suits who walked through the cafe like they were measuring it for a coffin. 20 minutes, Dylan repeated. I know. Marisol's eyes were wet. I tried to call you. It's fine. It wasn't fine. The espresso machine was half disassembled on the counter. The morning rush was about to start. And somewhere out there, a man named Preston Cole, the regional director who'd been sniffing around the place for 3 weeks now, asking pointed questions about operational viability and underperforming assets, was on his way here with a clipboard and a smile that never reached his eyes. Dylan had met men like Preston before. He didn't need to meet this one twice to know exactly how it would go.
Lily, sweetheart, can you sit at the table by the window for me? Just for a little bit? She nodded, gathering her crayons into her small arms like they were treasure, and toddled over to the corner table, the one with the wobbly leg Dylan had fixed himself with a folded napkin years ago and never gotten around to replacing properly. He watched her settle in, watched her pick up the blue crayon first, the way she always did, and something in his chest tightened the way it always did too. Single father. 32 years old. A wife who left when Lily was 8 months old and never came back, not even a phone call on birthdays. Dylan didn't think about her much anymore. He'd trained himself not to. But moments like this, moments where he had no good options and a kid who needed him to look calm, those were the moments her absence sat heaviest in his chest. He turned back to the espresso machine, started reassembling it with hands that didn't shake, even though everything inside him was shaking. The door jingled again, harder this time, less tired. Preston Cole walked in first, tall, sharp-suited, holding a tablet like a weapon. Behind him came two other men Dylan didn't recognize, and behind them, Dylan's hands stopped moving. A woman walked in last, and the entire cafe seemed to shift its attention toward her without anyone deciding to do it. She was young, younger than Dylan expected, 30 maybe, dressed in a charcoal coat that probably cost more than Dylan made in 2 months, dark hair pulled back severe and clean. She didn't look around the room the way the men with her did, scanning for flaws. She looked at the room like she was trying to understand it. "That's her," Marisol whispered, suddenly at Dylan's elbow. "Vivian Ashford."
Dylan had heard the name before, mostly in passing, mostly in tones that made it sound like a weather event. Vivian Ashford, sole heir and now CEO of Ashford Holdings, 30 years old, took over the company 18 months ago after her father's stroke and had been, depending on who you asked, either reshaping the company into something sharper and colder or quietly trying to undo the damage decades of her family's business decisions had caused. Dylan didn't know which version was true. He didn't have time to care. He had a broken espresso machine and a kid in the corner and a man in an expensive suit already striding toward the counter like he owned the floor Dylan was standing on. "Mr. Carter, is it?" Preston said, not waiting for confirmation. "I'm going to need you to step back from the equipment. I'm trying to fix it before the morning rush. I said step back." Preston's voice had the particular flatness of a man who'd practiced sounding important in a mirror. He turned to the tablet, started tapping notes, narrating half to himself, half for the small audience gathering. "Equipment failure, visible disrepair. This is... What's the third service call this month?" "Second," Dylan said quietly. "Doesn't matter. It's excessive." Preston looked up, and for the first time he really looked at Dylan. At the flour dust on his apron, the grease on his hands, the exhaustion that lived permanently under his eyes now. Whatever Preston saw, it seemed to please him. "Tell me, Mr. Carter, how long have you worked here?" 4 years. "And in that time, has this cafe ever turned a consistent profit?" Dylan's jaw tightened. "We've had some hard years. The pandemic hit us bad, and that's a no." Preston smiled, and it was the kind of smile Dylan recognized from every landlord and every collections call he'd ever taken. The smile of a man enjoying his own power a little too much. He raised his voice now, pitching it for the room, for the handful of regular customers who'd frozen mid-sip at their tables. "Folks, I apologize for the disruption. We're conducting an asset evaluation on behalf of the lender. It appears this establishment has been, frankly, mismanaged for some time." "That's not," Dylan started. "Equipment in disrepair. Staff who clearly can't keep a schedule." Preston glanced pointedly at Marisol, who shrank back like she'd been slapped. "And an employee," he continued, eyes back on Dylan, "who apparently thinks it's appropriate to bring his child to a place of business." The room went very quiet. Dylan felt the heat rise up the back of his neck, the old familiar burn of being talked down to, of being measured and found small. He'd felt it from teachers when he was a kid in foster care, bouncing between 3 different middle schools. He'd felt it from his ex-wife's family, who never once thought he was good enough for her, right up until she left anyway. He'd felt it from every manager who ever looked at his resume and saw gaps instead of the reasons behind them. He opened his mouth to defend himself, and then he heard it. A small, sharp intake of breath from the corner table. He turned, and his stomach dropped through the floor. Lily was staring at Preston with her crayon frozen mid-stroke, her bottom lip trembling, her eyes wide and glassy in that particular way that meant tears were about 4 seconds from falling. She'd heard every word. Of course she had. She was 6, not deaf, and Preston hadn't bothered to lower his voice at all. Every instinct in Dylan's body screamed at him to turn around and tell this man exactly what he could do with his tablet and his asset evaluation. He could feel the words sitting right there, loaded and ready. But he looked at his daughter's face, at the way her small shoulders had curled inward like she was trying to disappear into the chair, and something in him simply set the anger down. Not because it left, because there wasn't room for it right now. There was only room for her. He walked away from Preston Cole mid-sentence.
Didn't even look back to see the man's mouth still open, words still hanging unfinished in the air. "Hey," Dylan said softly, crouching down in front of Lily's chair, putting himself at her eye level the way he always did when the world got too loud for her. "Hey, look at me, Bug." "Daddy, that man's being mean to you." Her voice cracked on the last word. I know he is." Dylan reached out and wiped the first tear off her cheek with his thumb, slow and unhurried, like there wasn't a room full of strangers watching, like Preston Cole and his tablet and his clipboard weren't even in the building. "But you know what? His words don't change anything about who I am. You know that, right? What if he closes the cafe? Then we'll figure it out, like we always do." He smiled at her, and it cost him something to make it look easy, but he made it look easy anyway, because that was the job. That had always been the job, since the day she was born, and it became just the two of them against everything else. "You and me, Bug, we've gotten through harder stuff than a guy in a suit." She sniffled, looked down at her coloring book, at the half-finished drawing of what looked like a cat with the proportions of a small bear. "Can you sit with me for a second?" "Of course I can." He sat down across from her in the tiny chair, knees jammed up near his chest, completely indifferent to how it looked, and picked up a green crayon and started filling in the grass at the bottom of her page like the building wasn't being inspected, like his job wasn't on the line, like an entire room wasn't watching him fall apart and somehow not fall apart at the exact same time. Vivian Ashford had not moved from the doorway. She'd been standing there through the entire exchange, watching Preston perform his little theater of authority, watching the room shrink under his voice, and she'd been about to say something, some correction, some reminder to keep things professional, when the father turned away from all of it to comfort his daughter instead. She watched him crouch down, watched his voice drop into something so gentle it didn't seem to belong to the same man who'd just been backed into a corner in front of his coworkers. She watched him wipe a child's tears like there was nothing more urgent in the entire world, like Ashford Holdings and Preston Cole and the loan and the inspection had simply ceased to exist the moment his daughter needed him. Something about it didn't fit. Vivian had grown up around men who wielded power like a personality trait, her own father included, and she'd developed, over 30 years, a fairly reliable instinct for telling the difference between a man who was strong and a man who simply hadn't been challenged yet. The man kneeling by that table, the one Preston had just tried to publicly gut like a fish, hadn't fought back, hadn't even raised his voice. He'd looked for one unguarded second like he might, and then he'd looked at his daughter and made a different choice entirely. That wasn't weakness. Vivian had seen weakness plenty of times, and it didn't look like that. "Ms. Ashford?" Preston had appeared at her elbow, tablet angled toward her like an offering. "I think you can see the pattern here. Inconsistent management, disorganized staff, equipment that hasn't been properly maintained. Mr. Cole. And frankly, bringing a child into a working kitchen environment is a liability issue we should flag for. Mr. Cole, like..." Vivian's voice didn't rise, but something in it cut through his sentence like a wire. "I asked you to compile an honest operational assessment. I did not ask you to humiliate an employee in front of his own child." Preston blinked, recalibrating. "I was simply being thorough, Ms. Ashford. The lender's interests are served by an accurate evaluation, not a performance." She finally stepped further into the cafe, her eyes moving past Preston entirely, settling instead on the corner table, on the man and his daughter, on the green crayon moving slow and steady across a child's drawing of a bear-shaped cat. "Finish your equipment notes, quietly. I'll be looking around myself. With respect, that's not really necessary. I've already documented Mr. Cole." This time her voice did sharpen, just slightly, just enough. "That wasn't a request." He shut his mouth, walked away toward the kitchen, jaw tight, tablet clutched like a shield. Vivian stood alone for a moment near the counter, looking at the cracked tile, the mismatched chairs, the faded mural on the back wall that someone had clearly painted by hand years ago. A mural of a garden, vines curling around a wooden gate, the kind of thing that took love to make and money to maintain. And this cafe apparently had plenty of the first and none of the second. She thought about the spreadsheet sitting in her tablet bag. Revenue numbers trending downward for 3 straight quarters. A loan balance that,
on paper, made this place look like exactly what Preston wanted her to believe it was: a liability. A property worth more empty than occupied, a line item to be cleared. Then she looked again at Dylan Carter, still crouched in that absurdly small chair, his daughter laughing now. Actually laughing, the tears already forgotten in the easy, forgiving way that only children seemed capable of, because he'd apparently drawn the cat bear a tiny hat and was narrating something about the hat in a ridiculous voice that didn't match the steady, exhausted man from 5 minutes earlier at all. The spreadsheet didn't account for that. Vivian wasn't sure what column you'd even put it in. "Excuse me." She walked over, stopping a respectful distance from the table, and waited until Dylan looked up. His eyes were wary, guarded in the specific way of a man who'd just been humiliated and had no idea if round 2 was coming. "I'm sorry for the disruption. I didn't intend for it to go that way." Dylan straightened slightly, though he didn't stand, like he didn't want to lose the height advantage that kept him close to Lily. "With respect, ma'am, your guy seemed pretty intent on it going exactly that way." It was blunt. Maybe too blunt for a man talking to the person who, on paper, held his entire livelihood in her hands. But Vivian found she didn't mind it. Found, actually, that she respected it more than the careful, performative deference she usually got from people who knew exactly who she was. "He works for me," Vivian said, "which means it's my responsibility, not an excuse. I'll address it." Dylan studied her for a moment, like he was waiting for the catch, the part where this turned out to be another kind of performance. It didn't come. "This is Lily," he said instead, nodding toward his daughter, who had stopped narrating the Bearcat's adventures and was now staring up at Vivian with frank, unguarded curiosity, the way only small children could get away with. "Hi," Vivian said, and crouched down. Actually crouched, in a coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent, knees on a coffee shop floor that hadn't been mopped properly in who knew how long, until she was eye level with the girl. "I like your cat. Is he wearing a hat?" "He's a cat bear," Lily corrected with the particular seriousness only 6-year-olds could summon. "He doesn't like being cold." "That's very practical of him." Lily considered this answer, apparently found it acceptable, and went back to coloring. Vivian stood, brushed off her knees, and looked at Dylan again. And there was something different in her face now, something that hadn't been there when she walked through the door 20 minutes ago. "I'd like to look around the cafe properly," she said. "Not for the report, for myself. Would that be all right?" Dylan glanced toward the kitchen, where he could hear Preston's voice rising and falling in clipped, irritated tones, probably dictating notes about grease traps and outdated fryers. He glanced back at Vivian. "It's your call, ma'am. Not mine to give permission for." "I'm asking you anyway." That seemed to land somewhere. Dylan's shoulders eased, just slightly. "Sure. Go ahead." Vivian nodded and turned to walk the floor. Past the counter, past the mural, past the regulars who were watching her with the particular wariness of people who'd already decided, before she ever opened her mouth, what kind of person she was going to be. She didn't try to convince them otherwise. Not yet. She just walked and looked and let herself actually see the place instead of the numbers describing it. Behind her, she heard Lily's small voice drift up again, asking her father something about whether the lady was a princess, because her coat was very shiny, and she heard Dylan's tired, warm laugh answer that, "No, baby, she's not a princess. She's just somebody's boss." And Lily's immediate, devastating follow-up. "Is she going to fire you?" delivered with the casual brutality only children were capable of. Vivian didn't hear how Dylan answered. She'd already turned the corner toward the kitchen, where Preston was waiting with his tablet and his theories, and his certainty that this place and the man who held it together were nothing more than numbers waiting to be cut. She intended to find out, for herself, whether he was right. She had a feeling, quiet, persistent, impossible to fully explain yet, that he wasn't. Preston was still in the kitchen when Vivian walked in, crouched by the old friar with his tablet propped against his knee, muttering numbers into a voice memo like he was narrating a crime scene. He didn't hear her come in. She let him keep talking for a second, just to see what he'd say when he thought nobody important was listening. Friar's at least 15 years past recommended service life, grease traps overdue for inspection, and the walk-in's compressor is making a sound I wouldn't fly on a plane with, Preston said. Combine that with the espresso machine out front, this place is a liability lawsuit waiting to happen. I put the renovation cost at Mr. Cole. He startled, nearly dropped the tablet. Ms. Ashford, I didn't realize. Clearly. She walked past him to the walk-in cooler, opened it, looked inside. Clean. Organized. Labels on everything, dated, rotated front to back the way a kitchen was supposed to be run, and rarely was. You said the compressor's failing. It's old. Old isn't failing. Is it failing, or is it old? Preston hesitated half a second too long. It's due for service. That's a different sentence than the one you just recorded. Vivian closed the cooler door. Walk me through the financials again, not your summary, the actual numbers. He pulled them up, visibly annoyed now, and read off the figures. 3/4 of declining revenue, a loan balance that had ballooned after Walter took on renovation debt he never used, monthly expenses that, on their face, did look troubling. Vivian listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked the question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since she walked through the front door. What caused the renovation loan in the first place? What was it for? Preston flipped back through his notes. Roof repair mostly, and new electrical, I believe. Building's old. And was the renovation completed? A pause. Partially. Where did the rest of the money go? I don't have that breakdown in front of me. Vivian looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that made grown men in expensive suits suddenly very interested in their shoes. Get it. Today. I want to know exactly where every dollar of that loan went, line by line. Ms. Ashford, with respect, that's not really the scope of a standard asset evaluation. It is when I say it is. She turned to leave the kitchen, then stopped at the doorway. And Mr. Cole, the next time you decide to deliver a public lecture to an employee, in front of his child, on company time, while representing my firm, you'll clear it with me first, or there won't be a second time. She didn't wait for his answer. She didn't need one. So, by the time she walked back out to the floor, the morning rush had started in earnest. A thin trickle of regulars, mostly. An older man in a flannel shirt who ordered the same thing every day without needing to say it out loud. A young mother with a stroller who Marisol greeted by name. A construction crew that filed in for coffee and left within 90 seconds, like clockwork, like they'd done it every weekday for years. Dylan had gotten the espresso machine running again. Vivian watched him work it for a few minutes from across the room, watched the easy, practiced way his hands moved, watched him talk to Marisol low and quick, correcting something on the milk steamer without making it feel like a correction. Watched him slide a to-go cup across the counter to the flannel shirt man with a, "Here you go, Earl, careful, it's hot today," that suggested this wasn't a transaction so much as a routine they'd built together over years. She found a table in the corner, ordered a coffee from Marisol, who brought it over with hands that were still slightly unsteady, like she expected Vivian to find some reason to fire her on the spot, and sat there for the next 40 minutes, watching. She wasn't watching the cafe. Not really. She was watching Dylan. He fixed a wobbling chair leg between customers, just reached under the table and tightened something with a screwdriver he apparently kept in his apron pocket for exactly this purpose, and didn't mention it to anyone, didn't ask for credit, just moved on to the next thing like it hadn't happened. He noticed when an elderly customer struggled to carry her tray to a table and crossed the room without being asked to carry it for her. He caught Marisol when she dropped a stack of mugs, actually caught 2 of them out of the air before they hit the tile, and instead of getting annoyed, said something that made her laugh, the tension visibly draining out of her shoulders. And through all of it, Lily sat at her corner table, coloring, occasionally calling out "Daddy, look," and waiting, patient as anything, for him to glance over and admire whatever she'd drawn, which he always did, every single time, no matter how busy the counter got. Vivian found herself thinking about her own father, about boardrooms instead of coffee shops, about the particular silence that used to fall over a room when he walked in, a silence built entirely out of fear. She tried to remember the last time she'd seen him crouch down to anyone's eye level for any reason at all, and couldn't. "Can I get you anything else, ma'am?" Marisol was back, hovering, still nervous, still bracing for impact. "Marisol, right?" Vivian said. "Yes, ma'am." "You don't have to call me ma'am. Vivian's fine." She gestured at the empty chair across from her. Sit for a second, if you've got one. Marisol glanced toward the counter, where Dylan gave her a small nod. Go ahead, I've got it, and slid into the chair, perched on the edge of it like she might need to bolt at any moment. I'm not going to bite, Vivian said, a little wry. I just want to understand the place better than a tablet full of numbers can tell me. Marisol relaxed, marginally. What do you want to know? Tell me about Dylan. Something shifted in Marisol's face, surprise then something warmer. Dylan's the reason half of us still have jobs here, honestly. He covers for me when my car breaks down, which is like constantly, because it's a piece of junk. He never tells Walter when I'm late. He makes it not a problem. She glanced toward the counter, lowered her voice slightly. Last winter, the heater broke in here for like 4 days before Walter could afford to fix it, and Dylan brought in 2 space heaters from his own apartment, didn't ask for anything back. He's just like that. He doesn't make it a big deal. He just does it. And the equipment failures, the ones Mr. Cole was so concerned about? Marisol's expression tightened. That's the thing that doesn't make sense to me. Dylan's like obsessive about maintenance. He keeps a log, writes down every time something acts up, when he serviced it, what part he ordered. He cares about this place more than the actual owner does, honestly. No offense to Walter. He's just old and tired. The machine's been breaking down a lot lately, yeah, but it's weird. It's not like Dylan to let things slide. He doesn't let things slide. Vivian filed that away. It's weird. It's not like him. And turned it over slowly in her mind, the way she'd been trained to turn over any sentence in a financial report that didn't quite balance. Thank you, Marisol. That's all I wanted to know. The girl stood, hesitated, then asked the question that had clearly been sitting behind her teeth the whole conversation. Are you going to close us down? Vivian looked at her for a moment, at the genuine fear in her face, the kind that came from somebody who'd actually thought about what it would mean to lose this job, this place, not in the abstract, but in the very real terms of rent and groceries and a car that needed fixing. I don't know yet, Vivian said honestly. But I'm not going to decide based on a clipboard and 20 minutes in the building. I promise you that much. It seemed to be enough for now. Marisol nodded and went back to the counter, and Vivian sat alone with her coffee, watching Dylan work, watching Lily color, listening to the low hum of a cafe that, despite every number on Preston's tablet, felt very much alive. She came back the next day. She told herself it was due diligence, that a responsible evaluation took more than one visit, that Preston's numbers needed context before she made any recommendation to the lending committee. All of that was true. None of it was the whole reason, and she knew it, and she came anyway. She sat at the same corner table, ordered the same coffee, watched. This time, Lily wasn't there. Back at the after-school program, apparently, because Dylan mentioned it once to Marisol in passing, something about being relieved they'd sorted their staffing out. And the cafe felt different without her in it, quieter. Vivian found she missed the running commentary about the cat bear. Around 11, an older woman came in, 70-some years old, walking slow, leaning on a cane, and made her way to a booth near the window. Dylan was at the espresso machine mid-order, but he glanced up and something in his face changed. Mrs. Alvarez, he called over. Give me 1 second. He finished the drink he was making, handed it off, said something to Marisol, and crossed the room to the booth, crouching down beside it the same way he'd crouched beside Lily's chair the day before. How's the hip today? Vivian heard him ask. Aching something fierce, the old woman said. Doctor wants to put me on a list for surgery, but the wait's 6 months, and I can't be climbing my own stairs for 6 months. You still got that loose railing on the back porch? I do. My nephew said he'd come fix it, and then never did. I'll swing by Sunday. I'm off Sunday. The old woman's face folded into something soft and grateful. Dylan, you don't have to keep doing that. I know I don't have to. He smiled at her, easy, like the conversation cost him nothing, though Vivian was beginning to understand that nothing about Dylan Carter's kindness was actually free. It was paid for somewhere, in time he didn't have, or sleep he wasn't getting, or money that should have gone somewhere else. I want to. You want your usual? You know I do. He brought her tea without writing anything down, without her having to ask, and Vivian sat there turning over the small math of it. A man with a 6-year-old daughter and a job that barely covered rent, driving across town on his 1 day off, to fix an old woman's porch railing because nobody else would. She thought about Preston's tablet. Mismanaged, inconsistent, liability. None of those words fit what she was watching. 3 days into her visits, she finally caught Dylan during a lull. Mid-afternoon, the lunch rush cleared out, and the dinner crowd not yet arrived. He was wiping down the counter, methodical, unhurried, and looked up when she approached. "Back again?" he said. "Not unkind, just observing. I told you I wanted to understand the place properly. Most people who say that mean they want a reason to close it down faster." He set the rag aside, leaned against the counter, crossed his arms. Not aggressive, just tired, the posture of a man bracing out of habit. "No offense?" "None taken." Vivian sat on one of the stools. "Can I ask you something?" "You're gonna anyway." A small smile pulled at her mouth despite herself. "Fair." Mr. Cole's report flagged the equipment failures as a pattern of neglect. "Marisol told me that's not like you, that you're careful about maintenance, that you log everything." Something flickered across Dylan's face, quick, guarded, gone almost before she registered it. "Marisol talks too much." "Is she wrong?" He was quiet for a second, weighing something. "No, she's not wrong." He reached under the counter and pulled out a battered spiral notebook, set it on the bar between them, flipped it open. Page after page of handwritten entries, dates, times, what broke, what he fixed, what part he ordered, how much it cost. Meticulous. The handwriting of a man who took the job more seriously than the job probably deserved. "I've kept this since I started. Espresso machine's never given me trouble like it has the last 6 weeks. New problem every week, sometimes twice a week. I service it, it runs fine for a day or two, then something else goes." That sounds less like an old machine wearing out and more like something's wrong with it specifically. That's what I thought too. Dylan closed the notebook, slid it back under the counter, and something in his jaw tightened. "But I couldn't prove anything, and honestly, I figured if I said it out loud, that maybe somebody was messing with the equipment, it'd just sound like I was making excuses, looking for someone to blame instead of admitting the place is falling apart. It's not a crazy theory. Try telling that to a guy with a tablet who already decided I'm the reason this place is going under." Dylan's voice had an edge to it now, controlled but present, the first real crack Vivian had seen in his composure since she'd walked through the door 3 days ago. "You know what it's like being looked at like that? Like everything wrong in a place is your fault because you're the one standing closest to it when it breaks?" Vivian didn't answer right away. She thought about boardrooms, about being 30 years old and inheriting a company from a father everyone still compared her to, about the particular exhaustion of constantly being underestimated and overestimated in the same breath, depending on who was doing the looking. "I have some idea," she said finally. "Not the same kind, but some idea." Dylan studied her for a second, like he was recalibrating something. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Honestly, somebody who'd already made up their mind before they walked in the door. Most people in your position do. Most people in my position didn't grow up watching their father fire someone over the phone on Christmas morning because the quarterly numbers came in soft," Vivian said, and then seemed almost surprised she'd said it out loud, like the sentence had slipped past whatever filter usually caught things like that. "I'm not interested in being him." The cafe was quiet around them for a moment. Somewhere in the back, the new dishwasher rumbled to life, and Marisol called out something to a customer near the door, and the world kept turning the way it always did, indifferent to the small, real thing that had just passed between two people who, 3 days ago, had been on opposite sides of a clipboard. "I want to see the security footage," Vivian said, businesslike again, though something in her tone had softened. "From the kitchen, around the times your equipment failures happened." Dylan blinked. "We don't really... Walter never set up cameras back there. Budget." "There's a camera over the back door, isn't there? For the alley?" "Yeah, for deliveries and stuff. Why?" "Because if someone's been getting into this kitchen when they shouldn't be, that camera might have caught them coming or going." Vivian pulled her tablet out, made a note, all business now, though her mind was already 3 steps ahead. "I want full footage going back 2 months, today, if possible." "You think somebody's been sabotaging the equipment?" It wasn't a question. I think it's a possibility I'd be careless to ignore. And I think, Vivian added, standing, that if it's true, I know exactly who'd have a reason to want this cafe looking worse than it actually is. Dylan's eyes narrowed slightly. Cole. I'm not accusing him of anything yet. I don't have proof. But her face said otherwise, said she already had a working theory and didn't love where it pointed. I just want to look, quietly, before he knows I'm looking. That evening, after the cafe closed and Marisol had gone home, and Walter had shuffled out with his cane and his thanks, muttered the same way every night. Like he still couldn't quite believe Dylan stayed this late without being asked, Dylan sat in the back office, little more than a closet with a desk crammed into it, and pulled up the footage from the alley camera on Walter's ancient desktop computer. Vivian sat beside him, close enough that he could smell something faint and clean, expensive perfume worn so lightly it almost wasn't there, and he was aware of it in a way that annoyed him slightly, given everything else going on. There, Vivian said, leaning forward. Back up, right there. Dylan rewound the footage. 3 weeks ago, 11:47 p.m., long after closing. A figure in dark clothes, face obscured by a baseball cap pulled low, slipping through the alley door using what looked like a key, not forced entry, a key, and disappearing inside for 11 minutes before slipping back out. That's not Walter, Dylan said quietly. Walter doesn't move like that, and he doesn't have a key to the alley door, only the front. Who else has alley access? Me. Walter. And Dylan stopped. And? The contractor who did the partial renovation work, back when Walter took out that loan. Dylan's voice had gone low, careful, like he was building the sentence one piece at a time and didn't trust where it was going to land. He kept a key for the duration of the job, was supposed to give it back when the work stopped. Vivian was already pulling up something on her own tablet, cross-referencing, her expression hardening with each passing second. What was the contractor's name? Briggs. Why? Because, Vivian said slowly, turning the tablet toward him, Briggs Construction has been awarded 4 separate contracts from Ashford Holdings subsidiaries over the past 2 years, all of them recommended, on paper, by the same regional director. She looked up at him, and there was something cold and certain in her eyes now, something that had nothing to do with the warmth from earlier in the day. Preston Cole. The office went very quiet. You think Cole hired this guy to break my equipment? Dylan said slowly, so the place would look worse than it is, so you'd think it was failing on its own. I think, Vivian said, that I'm not going to assume anything until I have proof. But I also think it's not a coincidence that the equipment failures started 6 weeks ago, right around the time Cole first started pushing hard for this property to be reassessed. She closed the tablet, jaw set. I need more footage, every angle we've got, and I need to know exactly when Cole had access to the building, officially or not. Dylan looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't quite let himself since this whole thing started, since the woman in the expensive coat had crouched down to admire his daughter's drawing of a cat wearing a hat. Why are you doing this? He asked. You could have just signed off on Cole's report, closed the place, sold the property, moved on. Would have been easier. Vivian considered the question longer than he expected. Because I watched you comfort your daughter instead of defending yourself, she said finally. Most people, given the choice between looking weak in front of a room or looking strong, choose strong. You chose her. And I don't think a man who does that is the kind of man who lets equipment fall apart out of carelessness. I think something else is going on here, and I'd rather find out the truth than make a decision based on a report I already don't trust. Dylan didn't have an answer for that. Not right away. He just sat there in the cramped little office, the old computer humming, the alley footage frozen on the screen between them, and felt something shift quietly in his chest. Something that had nothing to do with the cafe, or the loan, or Preston Cole, and everything to do with the strange, unfamiliar sensation of being seen by somebody who had absolutely no reason to look that closely. Pull the footage, he said finally. All of it. I'll help you go through it. Vivian nodded, already reaching for the keyboard. Then let's find out exactly what Preston Cole has been doing in this kitchen when he thought nobody was watching. Outside, the streetlights flickered on over the empty cafe. The mural of the garden gate glowing faintly under them, and somewhere across town, in an office on the 40th floor of the Ashford Holdings building, Preston Cole had no idea that the woman he answered to was 3 weeks of footage away from unraveling everything he'd built. They went through the footage for 3 hours. The little office wasn't built for 2 people. Dylan had to angle his knees sideways just to fit beside the desk, and every time Vivian leaned in to point at the screen, he was aware of how close she'd gotten without either of them really deciding to let it happen. He tried not to think about it. There wasn't room for that right now, not with Lily probably already asleep at his sister's place across town, not with a stack of unpaid invoices sitting in his email, not with whatever they were about to find buried in 3 weeks of grainy alley footage. "There," Vivian said, freezing the frame again. "Same guy, same cap. Tuesday, 10:52 p.m. Dylan squinted at the screen. The figure moved different from a stranger. Too comfortable, too sure of where he was going, like a man who'd walked that alley 100 times and knew exactly which floorboard creaked and which one didn't. "That's got to be Briggs," he said. "Bill's right. He always carried himself like that, even on the original job, like he owned wherever he was standing." "Can you get a closer look at his face in any of these?" Dylan scrubbed back and forth, hunting for an angle where the cap brim lifted even slightly. Nothing. Whoever it was knew exactly where the camera sat and never once gave it a clean shot. "He's careful, doesn't look up, doesn't look at the camera, not once in 11 different visits." "That's not careless behavior. That's planning." Vivian leaned back, rubbing her eyes. "Pull the timestamps. I want to cross-reference every single one against Cole's calendar. His expense reports, his mileage logs, anything that puts him near this neighborhood on these specific nights. You can get his calendar?" "I'm the CEO, Dylan. I can get anyone's calendar." She said it without arrogance, just fact, the way someone might mention the weather. "The harder part's proving he didn't just happen to be in the area. I need something that connects him directly to Briggs, a phone record, an email, a payment." Dylan sat back, dragging a hand down his face. It was past 11 now, and the exhaustion of the day was starting to catch up with him. 4 years of double shifts and broken sleep had taught him exactly how far his body could be pushed before it started sending warning signs, and his shoulders were starting to send them. "Why would Cole even want to do this? I get that you said he gets contracts approved for Briggs, but I don't know, that feels like a small thing to risk a fraud charge over." "It's not small if you're patient about it." Vivian's voice had gone quieter, the careful tone of someone thinking out loud. "Properties that look like they're failing get bought cheap. Properties that get bought cheap get redeveloped. Redevelopment contracts go out to bid, and the same construction company keeps winning them. If Cole's been steering business to Briggs for 2 years, and Briggs has been helping properties look worse than they are right before acquisition, then it's not just this cafe," Dylan finished slowly. "It's a pattern, a whole system. That's what I'm worried about." Vivian closed the laptop, finally, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "If I'm right, and I really hope I'm not, this isn't the first small business Cole's done this to. It might just be the first one I happen to walk into in person instead of approving from a desk 40 floors up." Dylan looked at her for a long moment. There was something almost raw on her face right then, something that didn't match the polished, severe woman who'd walked through the front door 3 days ago in a coat that cost more than his monthly rent. She looked, for just a second, like someone realizing how much of what she'd trusted might have been built on something rotten. "You didn't know," he said, "about any of this?" "No." "Then it's not on you. It's on me the moment I find out and don't fix it." She stood, gathering her things, suddenly brisk again, like she'd let the crack show for exactly as long as she could afford to and now needed to close it back up. "I need to get back to the office. I have a contact in our internal audit team I trust, somebody who isn't going to run straight to Cole the second I start asking questions. I'll have her start pulling financial records tomorrow morning, quietly. And in the meantime, you keep that espresso machine running and you keep that notebook of yours updated every single time something breaks. If Briggs comes back, I want a precise log of exactly when." She paused at the office door, turned back. "And Dylan? Don't tell anyone what we found tonight. Not Marisol, not Walter, not anyone. If word gets back to Cole that we're looking at him, he'll cover his tracks faster than we can build a case." "You think he's smart enough to do that?" I think a man who's gotten away with this for 2 years is smart enough to do a lot of things. Vivian's jaw tightened. I just need to be smarter and faster. She was at her desk by 6 the next morning before her assistant arrived, before the floor below her office had even started to fill with the soft hum of 40 stories worth of employees logging in. She pulled up the audit request and sat with it for a long moment before sending it, because she knew exactly what she was setting in motion. And she knew, with the particular clarity that came from growing up in a family obsessed with appearances, that once this started, there would be no quiet way to walk it back. She sent it anyway. Subject: confidential. Internal review. Request: Priya. I need a discrete financial trace on all contracts awarded to Briggs Construction over the past 24 months, cross-referenced against properties flagged for operational concerns by regional evaluations. I need to know who recommended Briggs each time, and I need expense and mileage records for Preston Cole going back 6 weeks. This stays between us until I tell you otherwise. V. The reply came back within 20 minutes, which told Vivian that Priya Anand, head of internal audit and one of the only people at Ashford Holdings Vivian genuinely trusted, had read it the second it landed and understood exactly how serious it was without needing it spelled out. On it. Give me 48 hours. And Vivian, if this is what I think it might be, you're going to want legal in the room before you confront anyone. Vivian typed back a single word. Agreed. Then she sat at her desk, looking out at the city through 40 stories of glass, and thought about a 6-year-old girl with a half-colored cat bear, and a man who'd crouched down on a dirty cafe floor to wipe his daughter's tears instead of defending himself, and felt something settle into place inside her that hadn't been there in a very long time, something that felt almost like purpose instead of just obligation. Preston Cole, meanwhile, had no idea his world had started cracking. He spent that Thursday morning the way he spent most mornings, at his desk on the 38th floor, 2 below Vivian's, drafting a follow-up memo about Maple and Vine that framed the property in increasingly clinical, increasingly damning terms. Persistent equipment failures suggest deeper structural neglect. Recommend acquisition at distressed valuation, contingent on owner's inability to secure refinancing within 60 days. He read it over twice, satisfied, and forwarded it to the lending committee with a note suggesting it be expedited. He'd been working this particular angle for 2 years now, and he'd gotten good at it, good enough that it barely felt like what it was anymore. He told himself it was just business. Properties got reassessed. Values shifted. If a few of those shifts happened to be nudged along a little, well, that was just initiative. That was just understanding how the market actually worked instead of waiting around for it to work on its own. His phone buzzed. A text, from a number saved only as B. Machine acting up again like you wanted. Should I keep going, or are we good? Preston glanced at his closed office door, then typed back quickly. Hold off for now. Things are being looked at closer than usual. Don't go back for a while. How much closer? Don't worry about it. Just don't go back. He set the phone face down on his desk and tried to ignore the small, cold feeling crawling up the back of his neck. The one that always showed up right before something he'd built carefully for years started coming apart at the seams. He told himself it was nothing. Vivian was sentimental, that was all. She'd gone soft over a sob story about a single dad and his kid, and in a week or two, once the numbers spoke for themselves, she'd come back around to seeing it his way. She always did, eventually. She'd inherited the company, not the instincts. He didn't know yet exactly how wrong he was about that. 2 days later, Priya Anand walked into Vivian's office and closed the door behind her without being asked, which was, Vivian had learned over the 18 months they'd worked together, never a good sign. Sit down, Priya said, or don't. I don't think it matters which. That bad? Worse. Priya set a folder on the desk, thick with printouts, tabs sticking out at odd angles where she'd flagged things in a hurry. Briggs Construction has been awarded 6 contracts from Ashford-affiliated lending decisions over the past 2 years, all recommended by Preston Cole, all on properties that were independently flagged as distressed shortly before acquisition. 4 of those 6 properties were later sold to shell companies that, when I traced the ownership structure back far enough, lead to an account Cole controls through his wife's maiden name. Vivian felt something go very still in her chest. He's not just steering contracts, he's profiting directly from the acquisitions. That's what it looks like. I haven't finished tracing all the shell layers yet, but it's not subtle once you know where to look. He just bet nobody would look. Priya tapped the folder. And there's a text exchange. I pulled his company phone records. Standard for compliance, nothing invasive. And there's a number saved only as B that he's been in contact with for months, including 2 days ago. She slid a printout across the desk. Vivian read it twice. Machine acting up again like you wanted. Should I keep going or are we good? Hold off for now. Things are being looked at closer than usual. Don't go back for a while. That's it, Vivian said quietly. That's the proof. It's strong. It's not airtight on its own. A defense attorney could argue B is anybody, that machine acting up could mean a dozen things. But combined with the alley footage, the shell company structure, and the pattern across 6 different properties, Priya shook her head. Vivian, this isn't one bad decision. This is a system he's been running for years, right under your father's nose and then right under yours. Vivian sat back, staring at the folder, at the careful trail of paper that had taken Priya 2 days and a forensic accountant's patience to assemble, and felt something cold and clear settle over the anger that had been building in her chest since the moment she first saw that footage in the back office of a coffee shop. I want everything finalized by tomorrow morning, she said. Every contract, every shell account, that text exchange cross-referenced with the alley footage from the cafe. I want it airtight before I say a single word to him. And then, Vivian said, standing, I want him in a room. Today's not the day, but soon. I want to watch his face when he realizes exactly how much rope he's given me to hang him with. It was raining the night Briggs came back to the cafe. Dylan almost didn't catch it. He'd closed up late, finishing the deep clean of the kitchen that always happened on Friday nights, and he was halfway out the back door, trash bags in hand, when he heard it, a soft scrape of metal against metal, coming from somewhere near the alley entrance, too deliberate to be the wind. He froze. Vivian's words came back to him immediately. Don't tell anyone. Keep the notebook updated. If Briggs comes back... He set the trash bags down slowly, quietly, and eased back toward the kitchen door instead of forward, pulling his phone out with shaking hands. He didn't call the police, not yet. He didn't have proof of anything, just a man in a hoodie fumbling with a lock he shouldn't have a key to. And Dylan had learned a long time ago, growing up the way he had, that calling the police on a black or brown man fumbling with a lock in the rain didn't always go the way it was supposed to, and he wasn't about to risk that on a hunch. He called Vivian instead. She picked up on the second ring. Dylan? He's here, Dylan whispered, pressed flat against the inside of the kitchen door, watching the alley through the small window in its frame. Briggs. Or somebody. Same cap, same build. He's at the alley door right now. Don't go out there. Her voice had gone sharp, urgent. Dylan, do not confront him. I'm 15 minutes away. I was working late. I'll call security and the police both. Just stay inside and stay where he can't see you. He's got a key. He's coming in. Then get somewhere safe and stay quiet. I mean it. I am not having you get hurt over an espresso machine. Dylan's heart was pounding hard enough that he could feel it in his throat, but he did what she said. Slipped back into the dry storage room, eased the door mostly shut, left just enough of a gap to see through, and waited in the dark with his phone pressed silent against his ear, listening to Vivian's breathing on the other end, listening to the sound of his own pulse, listening to the alley door creak open outside. Footsteps. Slow. Confident. A man who'd done this enough times to stop being nervous about it. The kitchen lights flicked on. Just the small one over the prep station, not the overheads, like whoever it was knew exactly which switch to hit to avoid drawing attention from the street. Dylan watched through the gap in the storage room door as the figure crossed to the espresso machine, set down a small toolbox, and crouched in front of it. It was Briggs. Dylan recognized the walk now that he could see it up close, recognized the particular way the man tilted his head when he was concentrating, a habit Dylan remembered from 2 years ago when Briggs had spent 6 weeks half finishing the renovation work Walter never got the rest of his money for. Briggs pulled something small from the toolbox. Dylan couldn't see exactly what, but it looked like a tool, something thin and precise. and reached into the back panel of the machine. Dylan's phone buzzed silently against his ear. A text from Vivian, even as they were still connected on the call, like she'd pulled up a second screen mid-conversation. Security's 3 minutes out. Police right behind them. Stay where you are. He typed back one-handed, careful not to make a sound. He's working on the machine right now, doing something to the back panel. Get a video if you can do it without being seen. Don't risk it if you can't. Dylan eased his phone up, angled it through the gap in the door, and started recording. His hands were shaking, and the footage would probably be useless, grainy, and unsteady, but he held it as still as he could and watched through the screen as Briggs worked something loose inside the machine's housing. A small component, deliberately bent, deliberately weakened, the kind of sabotage that wouldn't show up as obvious damage, but would cause exactly the slow, mysterious failures that had been plaguing the espresso machine for 6 weeks straight. The proof Dylan had been desperate for over a month was happening in real time 8 feet away from him, and all he could do was stand in the dark and film it and pray his hands stopped shaking long enough to get something usable. Red and blue light flickered faintly against the alley wall outside, still distant but closing. Briggs straightened up too fast, head snapping toward the window, and for one terrible second Dylan thought he'd been seen. But it wasn't him Briggs had noticed. It was the lights, the first hint of sirens cutting through the rain, and the man swore under his breath, shoved his toolbox closed, and bolted for the alley door. He didn't make it. 2 security guards from Ashford Holdings, the same ones who'd flanked Preston during the inspection days earlier, came through the alley door just as Briggs reached it, and behind them, moving fast despite the rain, despite the coat that definitely wasn't built for sprinting, came Vivian herself, soaked through, hair plastered to her face, looking less like a billionaire CEO in that moment than anyone Dylan had ever seen. "That's him," Dylan said, stepping out of the storage room, phone still raised, footage still running. "That's the guy from the cameras. I got him on video right now, messing with the espresso machine." Briggs tried to twist free of the guard holding his arm. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was just—" "Save it," Vivian said, breathing hard, water dripping off her chin. "We have footage of you doing this 11 separate times over the past 6 weeks. We have a text exchange between you and Preston Cole discussing exactly this. And as of about 90 seconds ago, we have a police officer who's going to want to ask you some very direct questions about breaking and entering and criminal property damage." She looked at him, and there was nothing soft in her face at all anymore. Nothing of the woman who'd crouched down to admire a child's drawing days earlier. "I'd start thinking real hard about whether you want to take this fall alone or whether you want to tell us exactly who's been paying you and how much." Briggs's bravado cracked almost instantly. The particular fast collapse of a man who'd never actually expected to get caught and had no plan at all for what happened if he did. "It was Cole. Preston Cole. He's been paying me to mess with the equipment in 2 other places too, not just this one. He said it was just business. Said the properties were going to get bought either way, and this just sped things up." 2 other places, Vivian repeated, low, almost to herself, and Dylan watched something harden behind her eyes, the full weight of exactly how far this went finally landing. "Which ones?" Briggs gave the names: a hardware store 3 neighborhoods over, a small bakery near the waterfront, and Dylan watched Vivian's jaw tighten with each one, watched her pull out her phone immediately, even standing in the rain with a confessed saboteur 6 feet away, and start typing instructions to Priya, to legal, to whoever needed to know that this wasn't a single bad decision contained to one coffee shop. It was a pattern, a system. Years of small businesses quietly gutted so a man with a tablet and a title could line his own pockets while telling himself it was just business. The police arrived a minute later, and the alley filled with more lights, more questions, more procedure. And somewhere in the middle of it, Dylan found himself standing under the small overhang by the back door, soaked despite barely having stepped outside, watching Vivian give a statement to an officer with the same precise, controlled clarity she brought to everything, and thought, not for the first time that week, that he had badly misjudged what kind of person walked through that door 4 days ago, wearing a coat that cost more than his rent. She caught his eye across the alley, just for a second, in the middle of giving her statement, and something passed between them that didn't need words. Relief, maybe, or vindication, or just the simple, exhausted recognition of two people who'd spent days chasing the same impossible truth and had finally caught it. It wasn't over yet. Briggs's confession named Cole, but naming wasn't the same as proving, not in a courtroom, and there was still a meeting coming that neither of them was looking forward to. The one where Vivian would have to sit across from a man she'd trusted with regional decisions for 2 years and watch him understand in real time exactly how much they already knew. But standing in that alley, rain easing into a drizzle, sirens finally going quiet, Dylan allowed himself, for the first time in 6 weeks, to believe that the truth might actually be enough to save the only steady thing he had left to give his daughter. Vivian didn't sleep that night. She got home around 2 in the morning, hair still damp, and sat at her kitchen island with Priya's folder spread out in front of her, adding Briggs's confession to the pile, cross-referencing the hardware store and the bakery he'd named, watching the pattern get uglier the longer she stared at it. By 5, she'd drafted 3 different versions of what she was going to say to Preston Cole, and deleted all 3, because none of them felt like enough. She gave up trying to write it down. Some conversations you didn't script. You just walked into the room and let the truth do the talking. She called Priya at 6. "Tell me you slept," Priya said by way of greeting. "I didn't. Briggs gave us 2 more properties, a hardware store and a bakery, both flagged by Cole within the last 14 months, both acquired by the same network of shell companies." A pause on the other end. "I'll have someone pull those files the second the office opens. Vivian, this is bigger than I thought it was 2 days ago." "I know." "Legal's going to want to be in the room when you confront him. Actually in the room, not on a call. This needs to be documented properly if we're going to terminate him and pursue charges." "I know that too." Vivian rubbed her eyes. 10 o'clock. My office. I want him blindsided. No warning, no chance to call a lawyer of his own before he's already sitting across from me. "And the cafe? Carter and the owner? What's happening with the loan situation while all this plays out?" Vivian looked at the printout of the alley footage still open on her laptop screen, the frozen frame of Briggs crouched in front of the espresso machine, the small bent component visible even in the grainy resolution. "The loan situation," she said slowly, "is about to look very different once the lending committee understands the distressed valuation was manufactured. I'll handle that personally, today, if I can." Preston Cole walked into Ashford Holdings at 8:45 that morning, the way he walked in every morning. Coffee in one hand, phone in the other, already running through the day's agenda in his head, already 3 moves ahead in whatever game he thought he was playing. He didn't notice anything different about the floor. Didn't notice the way the assistant outside Vivian's office wouldn't quite meet his eyes when he passed her desk an hour later. He had a 9:30 with a different client. A 10 o'clock he assumed was just a routine check-in Vivian's assistant had scheduled, the kind of thing that happened a dozen times a month. He had no idea, walking through that door at 10 exactly, that the room had already been rebuilt around him while he wasn't looking. Vivian's office was bigger than most apartments Dylan had ever lived in. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides. The city stretched out gray and busy below. A long glass conference table that seated 10 and currently seated 4. Vivian sat at the head. Priya Anand sat to her right, a folder open in front of her, the same folder that had grown twice as thick overnight. Beside Priya sat a woman Preston didn't recognize, introduced simply as legal counsel, who said nothing and wrote everything down. And in the 4th chair, slightly apart from the others, sat Dylan, still in his cafe apron because Vivian had asked him to come straight from his morning shift. No time to change, and he'd come anyway because she'd asked. Preston's easy smile faltered the second he saw him. "Ms. Ashford," he said, recovering fast, sliding into the empty chair like he belonged there. "I wasn't told this was a full meeting? What's going on?" "Sit down, Preston." "I am sitting down." His eyes flicked between the faces around the table, landing longest on Dylan, on the apron, on the way Dylan was watching him with an expression that had nothing soft left in it at all. "What's he doing here?" "He's here because this concerns him directly." Vivian opened her own folder, slow and deliberate, in no hurry at all, savoring none of it, but not rushing past it either. "I want to walk you through something, Preston." 3 weeks ago, you stood in Maple and Vine Café and told a room full of customers that the equipment failures there were evidence of mismanagement. Do you remember saying that? I remember an honest assessment of the property's condition. Yes. An honest assessment. Vivian repeated the words slowly, like she was testing their weight. Tell me, in your professional opinion, what causes an espresso machine that's been meticulously maintained for 4 years to suddenly start failing 11 separate times over 6 weeks? Preston's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Equipment fails. It's old. These things happen. They do happen. Vivian slid a printout across the table, a still frame from the alley footage, Briggs frozen mid-step through the back door, key in hand. This is a man named Daniel Briggs. He's a contractor who did partial renovation work at the cafe roughly 2 years ago and was supposed to return his key when the job stopped. He never did. We have footage of him entering the cafe through that alley door, after hours, 11 separate times over the past 6 weeks. She let that sit for a second before sliding a second photo across. A close, clear frame. This one from a security camera angle the alley footage hadn't captured, pulled, and enhanced overnight by Priya's team. We also have him, in custody as of last night, with his hands inside the espresso machine's back panel, deliberately damaging a component. Preston didn't say anything. His knuckles had gone white where his hand rested on the table. And this, Vivian continued, sliding a third printout across, the text exchange, machine acting up again like you wanted. Should I keep going or are we good? Is a conversation between Mr. Briggs and a phone number registered to you, Preston. Sent 2 days ago, the same day I started asking questions about the equipment failures. The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere below the glass, the city kept moving, indifferent. That doesn't prove anything, Preston said finally, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence, gone thin around the edges. Text can be sent from anywhere. Anybody could have. It's your phone number, Preston, registered to your name, your billing address. Priya spoke for the first time, calm, clinical. The voice of someone who'd spent 2 days building an argument she had no intention of losing. And it's not the only thing we've found. Briggs Construction has been awarded 6 contracts from Ashford-affiliated lending decisions over the past 2 years. All 6 recommended by you personally. 4 of those properties were sold afterward to shell companies. And when we traced the ownership of those shells, all 4 led back to an account connected to your wife's maiden name. Preston's face had gone the particular gray color of a man watching his own ceiling cave in. You've been manufacturing distress in properties you're supposed to be objectively evaluating, Vivian said, and her voice was steady, controlled, but underneath it Dylan could hear something sharp and cold that hadn't been there in the cafe, something that belonged entirely to this room, to this version of her. You sabotage equipment so a business looks like it's failing. You inflate the cost of needed repairs in your reports. You push for accelerated acquisition at distressed valuation, and then the property gets redeveloped, using your contractor, who you've been steering business to for 2 years. And you quietly profit on the back end through a shell structure you thought nobody would ever bother tracing. She closed the folder. How many businesses, Preston? Maple and Vine wasn't the first. Briggs already gave us 2 more names. How many total? I want a lawyer, Preston said. You're welcome to one. Effective immediately, your employment with Ashford Holdings is terminated for cause, and I'm referring this entire file to the district attorney's office for criminal fraud, vandalism, and conspiracy charges. Legal will walk you through the formal documentation. Vivian's voice didn't rise, didn't shake, didn't give him a single inch of satisfaction to hold on to. Your access to the building has already been revoked. Security will escort you to collect personal items, and you will not be permitted back on this floor, or any floor, without legal supervision. You can't just, I can. I just did. She stood, and that seemed to be the cue everyone else had been waiting for, because Priya and the lawyer rose too, and the meeting, in some final and absolute way, was over. I trusted you with regional decisions that affected real people's lives, Preston. People who had nothing to do with whatever quiet little system you built for yourself. I'm done being careless about who I trust. Security came for him a minute later. 2 guards, polite but unmistakably firm, the same ones who'd stood flanking him at the cafe inspection 3 weeks earlier,
now standing on the other side of an entirely different line. Preston didn't fight it. He didn't have anything left to fight with. He just stood, looked once more around the table, at Vivian, at Priya, longest at Dylan, like he still couldn't quite process how a man in a coffee-stained apron had been the loose thread that unraveled 2 years of careful work, and walked out without another word. The door closed behind him, and the room exhaled. "That's it?" Dylan said quietly into the silence. "He's just gone?" "That's the start of it." Vivian sat back down, suddenly looking every bit as tired as Dylan felt, the adrenaline of the confrontation draining out and leaving something heavier behind. "The criminal case will take months. There's a lot more tracing to do. The bakery, the hardware store, whoever else got caught in this. But the part that affects you and Walter directly, that part I can fix today." "What do you mean?" Vivian looked at Priya, who nodded and pulled a fresh document from her folder, sliding it across the table. "The loan against Maple and Vine," Vivian said, "was based on a valuation that I now know was deliberately manipulated. That makes the entire assessment invalid. I'm voiding the distressed classification, effective immediately, and I'm restructuring the loan terms myself. Lower interest, extended timeline, and enough forgiveness on the balance that Walter can actually breathe for the first time in 2 years." She paused. "I'm also covering the cost of a full equipment renovation. New espresso machine, the walk-in cooler serviced properly. The fryer replaced if it actually needs it instead of just being old. Out of pocket, not the company's, mine." Dylan stared at her. "Vivian, it's the least I can do, considering my own company nearly destroyed that cafe based on a lie my own regional director manufactured." Her voice had gone quieter now, less CEO and more the woman who'd crouched down on a dirty cafe floor to admire a child's drawing. "But I'm not buying the place, Dylan. I want to be clear about that. I'm not interested in owning Maple and Vine or controlling it or putting my name on it. It stays Walter's. It stays exactly what it's always been. I'm just making sure it gets the chance it should have had all along, instead of being sabotaged out of existence by someone who saw it as a line item." Something in Dylan's chest, something that had been clenched tight for 6 weeks straight, finally let go. "Walter doesn't know any of this yet," he said. "About Cole, about the loan, any of it. He's going to need to hear it from somebody who isn't a stranger in a suit." "Then let's go tell him together," Vivian said, standing, gathering the folder. "He should hear it today. He's been carrying this weight a lot longer than you have, I'd guess." Walter Higgins was 71 years old and had run Maple and Vine for nearly 4 decades, through 3 recessions, 2 divorces that weren't his, and a heart scare 5 years back that the doctors said should have slowed him down and somehow hadn't. He was behind the counter when Dylan and Vivian walked in together that afternoon, restocking napkin dispensers with the slow, careful movements of a man who didn't trust his hands the way he used to. "Dylan," he said, glancing up, "you're not supposed to be back until your shift starts," and his eyes shifted to Vivian, narrowing slightly, the old wariness of a man who'd been burned by people in nice coats before. "Ms. Ashford, should I be worried?" "Sit down, Walter," Dylan said gently. "We've got something to tell you. It's good news, I promise. But it's a lot." They told him everything, sitting in the same corner booth where Lily usually colored, Walter's weathered hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he never drank, his face shifting through disbelief and anger and something that looked almost like grief as the full shape of it landed. 2 years of his cafe being quietly, deliberately sabotaged by a man he'd never even met in person. A man who existed to him only as signatures on loan paperwork and clipped phone calls about late payments. 2 years, Walter said finally, voice rough. "I thought I was just losing my touch. I thought maybe I'd gotten too old to run this place right anymore. I was already thinking about how I'd tell Dylan I might have to sell, because I figured it was my fault things kept falling apart." "It was never your fault," Vivian said quietly. "And it's not your fault now. Cole's been terminated. The loan's being restructured on fair terms, and I'm covering the renovation costs personally. This cafe isn't going anywhere, Walter. Not unless you decide that's what you want." Walter looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes.
Pride and suspicion and exhaustion, and slowly, underneath all of it, something that looked almost like hope, the kind a man stops letting himself feel after enough years of disappointment. "Why?" he asked finally. "You're a billionaire. You could have just signed off on the report, taken the property, made it into something that actually turns a profit for your company instead of barely scraping by. Why go through all this trouble for one little cafe?" Vivian glanced at Dylan, just for a second, something passing between them that Walter couldn't quite name but noticed anyway. "Because somebody showed me what this place actually is," she said. "Not the number on a spreadsheet. The actual thing. The kid getting her hot chocolate with extra whipped cream every Tuesday because her mom can only afford it once a week. The old woman in the booth by the window who comes in for tea and conversation because she lives alone now. The employee who covers shifts for a teenager whose car keeps breaking down and never says a word about it and slips her gas money so she doesn't have to ask." She looked at Walter steadily. "Spreadsheets don't have a column for that, but it's worth more than anything on the spreadsheet, and I almost let somebody destroy it because I didn't bother to look closely enough, soon enough." Walter's eyes had gone wet, and he wiped at them with the back of his hand, gruff about it, embarrassed, the way men his generation tended to be about crying in front of people. 40 years, he said. 40 years I've run this place, and I don't think anybody's ever said it back to me like that, like they actually saw it." "I see it now," Vivian said. "That's the part I can't undo, but I can make sure I don't make the same mistake twice." The renovation started 2 weeks later. It wasn't flashy. Vivian had been clear about that from the start, sitting across from a contractor she'd vetted personally, someone with no connection to Briggs or anyone like him, someone who'd worked with small businesses for 20 years and understood the assignment the moment Vivian explained it. "Don't make it look like a different cafe. Make it look like this cafe. The way it was supposed to look all along before things started falling apart. New espresso machine, the kind that could run for a decade without complaint. The walk-in cooler's compressor finally replaced instead of patched together one more time. The cracked tile gone, replaced with something close enough in color that it didn't feel like erasure, just repair. The mural on the back wall, the garden, the vines curling around the wooden gate, carefully restored by a local artist instead of painted over, because Vivian had asked specifically, and Walter had nearly cried again when she did, because his late wife had painted that mural herself, 20-some years ago, and he'd never told anyone that until that exact conversation. Dylan worked through most of it on his days off, not because anyone asked him to, but because he genuinely couldn't help himself. And Vivian started showing up on those days too. Not as an inspector now, not with a tablet or a clipboard, just as someone who'd somehow, over the course of 3 intense, exhausting, strange weeks, become something like a friend, though neither of them had quite found the right word for it yet. Lily, predictably, adopted her completely. "Are you going to come every day now?" the little girl asked one Saturday afternoon, perched on the same overturned milk crate she'd claimed as her own months ago, watching Vivian, in jeans now, hair down, nothing at all like the woman in the charcoal coat, attempt, badly, to help Dylan hang a new light fixture. "I don't know about every day," Vivian said, handing Dylan a screwdriver he hadn't actually asked for. "But probably a lot of days." "Good." Lily considered this with the same gravity she brought to everything. "You're better than the mean clipboard man." "That's a low bar, Bug," Dylan said from up on the ladder, laughing despite himself, the kind of easy laugh that had been rare in his life for longer than he wanted to admit. "I'm serious. He made you sad. She makes you smile a lot now." Lily said it simply, the way kids said the truest things, without any sense of how loudly it landed in the room. "Are you going to marry her?" "Lily." Dylan nearly dropped the screwdriver. Vivian, to her credit, didn't flinch, though color rose fast in her cheeks. "I think that's a conversation for when you're a lot older, sweetheart." "That's not a no," Lily said, satisfied, and went back to her coloring book like she hadn't just leveled both adults in the room with a single sentence. Dylan glanced down from the ladder, caught Vivian's eye, and for a second neither of them said anything at all. Just the particular charged silence of two people who both knew the kid wasn't entirely wrong, even if neither of them was ready to say so out loud yet. Not with everything else still settling, not with a courtroom date for Preston Cole still somewhere on the horizon, not with the dust from the renovation still literally hanging in the air around them. Hand me the level, Dylan said, finally, breaking the moment. And Vivian did, and the work went on, the way work always did, the way it had carried Dylan through every hard year of his life before this one. Except this time, for the first time in longer than he could remember, it didn't feel like carrying the weight alone. The grand reopening fell on a Saturday in late spring, the kind of morning that arrived clean and bright after a week of rain, like the city itself had decided to cooperate. Dylan got there before sunrise, same as always, except this time there was no broken espresso machine waiting for him, no cracked gasket, no 4 minutes of dread before the morning rush. Just a quiet kitchen that worked the way it was supposed to, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling settling into his chest that took him a few minutes to name. Calm. He hadn't felt that in a long time. Walter showed up an hour later, dressed in a clean shirt he'd clearly ironed for the occasion, standing in the doorway for a long moment just looking at the place. The restored mural glowing soft in the early light, the new tile, the gleam off equipment that wasn't going to give out on him next week. He didn't say anything for a while, just stood there with his hand on the doorframe like he needed something solid to hold on to while he took it in. 41 years, he said finally, mostly to himself. Didn't think I'd get to see it look like this again. You did the hard part, Walter, Dylan said, coming around the counter to stand beside him. Kept it alive when nobody would have blamed you for letting it go. Didn't feel like a choice most days. Felt like I just didn't know how to do anything else. Walter glanced at him, eyes a little wet, gruff about it the way he always was. You're the one who actually kept it standing, son. Don't think I don't know that. Dylan didn't have a good answer for that, so he just nodded, and the two of them stood there together for a minute, watching the morning light move slowly across a cafe that had nearly been taken from both of them and wasn't. By 10, the place was full in a way Dylan had never seen it, not the thin trickle of regulars he'd built his whole routine around, but a real crowd. Neighbors and strangers both. People who'd heard the story secondhand through the kind of word of mouth that moved fast in a tight community. People curious to see what had become of the little cafe that almost got swallowed up by a corporation and somehow didn't. Marisol worked the register with a kind of energy Dylan hadn't seen from her in months, practically glowing, no longer carrying herself like she was bracing for the next bad thing to happen. Her car had finally gotten fixed, too. Vivian had quietly arranged for that, in a way that didn't feel like charity, framed instead as a thank you for everything Marisol had handled with grace during the chaos. And Marisol had cried for a solid 5 minutes the day she found out, then immediately gone back to work like nothing happened, because that was who she was. Mrs. Alvarez had her usual booth by the window, tea already steaming in front of her, her hip apparently a little better after the surgery she'd finally gotten off the waiting list for. Something else Vivian had quietly nudged along, a phone call here, a recommendation there, never making a show of it, never wanting credit, just fixing what she could fix with the resources she happened to have. And Lily was exactly where she always was, at the corner table, except today the table had a fresh coat of paint and a leg that no longer wobbled, and she was coloring a new drawing. Not the cat bear this time, but 3 figures standing in front of a building that was unmistakably the cafe, holding hands, a sun overhead with a crooked smile drawn into it. "Who's that?" Vivian asked, sliding into the seat across from her, having arrived an hour ago and spent most of it helping Marisol behind the counter, sleeves pushed up, completely unrecognizable as the woman who'd walked through these doors in a charcoal coat 3 months earlier. "That's you, and that's Daddy, and that's me," Lily said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "We're standing outside the cafe because it's home." Vivian looked at the drawing for a long moment, something tightening in her throat that she hadn't expected and didn't entirely know how to handle. She'd spent 30 years being trained to read balance sheets, to find the story hidden inside a column of numbers, and none of that training had prepared her for how completely a 6-year-old's crayon drawing could undo her. "Can I keep this one?" she asked. "You can keep all of them if you want," Lily said generously. "I make a lot." "What?" Dylan found Vivian outside a little later, on the small patch of sidewalk near the front window, away from the noise of the crowd, looking at the new sign Walter had insisted on, the one that still read Maple and Vine in the same hand-painted lettering it always had, nothing changed except a fresh coat of varnish protecting it from another 40 years of weather. "You holding up okay?" he asked.
handing her a coffee, her usual order now, which had taken him exactly one visit to memorize, because that was just how his brain worked, cataloging the small details of the people he cared about without ever really deciding to. Better than okay. She took the cup, wrapped both hands around it, looked out at the street instead of at him. I got a call this morning from the DA's office handling Cole's case. Dylan felt something tighten in his chest. And? He's taking a plea. Fraud, conspiracy, criminal mischief across all 6 properties. Turns out it wasn't just 2 more besides the cafe, it was 4 once they finished tracing everything. He's looking at real time, not the kind of sentence that gets reduced to a fine and a strongly worded letter. She finally looked at him. The hardware store and the bakery both get their loans restructured the same way Walter's did. Same terms. I made sure of that personally before any of this went public. You didn't have to do all that. I did, actually. Vivian's voice had gone quiet, serious. I spent 18 months running that company the way I thought I was supposed to, trusting the people my father trusted, assuming the systems he built were sound just because they'd always been there. I never once thought to ask what those systems actually cost the people on the other end of them. Cole didn't build that rot by himself, Dylan. He built it inside a structure that let him, because nobody was looking closely enough to notice. She shook her head slowly. I'm not going to be the kind of person who looks away again. Not after this. Dylan studied her for a moment, the same instinct that had made him wary of her on day 1, when she'd walked through that door flanked by suits and clipboards, now completely rewritten into something else entirely. He thought about all the men in his life who'd had power and used it carelessly, and all the people who'd had none, and somehow used what little they had with more integrity than the powerful ever managed. He'd never expected to find someone who belonged to neither category cleanly, someone with every advantage in the world who'd actually chosen, when it mattered, to look harder instead of looking away. For what it's worth, he said, I don't think you needed Cole's mess to teach you that. I think you already had it in you. It just hadn't been tested yet. Vivian smiled, small and a little surprised, like the compliment had caught her off guard. That's a generous read of someone who almost let a coffee shop get destroyed because she didn't bother checking the numbers closely enough the first time. You checked eventually. That's the part that matters. Dylan leaned against the brick beside her, coffee in hand, watching the street, watching people come and go from the cafe behind them. Most people don't go back and check at all. They just move on to the next number on the next spreadsheet. They stood there for a while in comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling, the kind that had taken 3 months of footage and fraud and late nights in cramped offices to build between 2 people who, on the surface, had absolutely nothing in common. I have something to ask you, Vivian said finally, and I want you to actually think about it before you answer, not just say yes because you feel like you owe me something. You don't owe me anything, Dylan. I want to be clear about that. Okay? Ashford Holdings is restructuring how we handle community redevelopment going forward. No more blind acquisitions based on spreadsheets alone. I want a community advisory position, someone who actually understands what these businesses mean to the people around them, someone who can walk into a property before we make any decision and tell me what the numbers won't. Someone the neighborhoods we operate in would actually trust because he's lived it himself. She paused. I want that to be you. Dylan blinked. Me? Vivian, I make coffee for a living. I don't know the first thing about... You know exactly the thing that matters most. You know what it feels like to be the guy standing behind the counter when somebody with a clipboard decides your whole life is a liability on a spreadsheet. That's not nothing. That's actually the entire point. Her voice had gone earnest now, none of the boardroom precision left in it. I can hire 100 people who understand finance. I need somebody who understands what finance costs when nobody's paying attention to the human side of it. I need somebody who'll tell me the truth even when it's inconvenient, the way you did from the very first day, standing behind that counter telling Cole's assistant the broken machine wasn't your fault before you even knew who I was. Dylan was quiet for a long moment, turning it over. Part of him? The part that had spent 4 years bracing for the next hard thing. The part that had learned not to trust good fortune when it showed up too easily. Wanted to say no on instinct. Wanted to stay exactly where he was, safe in the small, known shape of his life. But he thought about Lily's drawing. 3 figures,
holding hands, standing in front of home. He thought about Mrs. Alvarez's hip, about Marisol's car, about all the small, quiet good Vivian had done without asking for credit for any of it. And he thought, not for the first time, that maybe the size of someone's impact didn't have to shrink just because the room they worked in got bigger. "I'm not leaving the cafe," he said finally. "I'll keep working here, mornings and afternoons, same as always. Walter needs me, and honestly, I need this place too. But if there's room for both—" "There's room for both," Vivian said quickly, like she'd been hoping he'd say exactly that. "I'm not trying to pull you out of the life you built. I'm trying to make sure that life doesn't get destroyed again by somebody else's spreadsheet, somewhere else, to some other family who doesn't have anyone fighting for them." Dylan thought about all the cafes and hardware stores and bakeries out there right now, run by people just like Walter, just like him, people who poured everything they had into something small and real with no idea that somewhere on the 40th floor of a glass building, a decision was being made about their whole life by someone who'd never once walked through their door. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, let's do it." Vivian's smile, when it came, was the first one Dylan had seen from her that looked completely unguarded, not the careful, controlled expression of a CEO. Managing a room, just relief, plain and simple, the look of someone who'd taken a risk on trusting their own instincts and watched it pay off. Inside, the cafe noise rose and fell in easy waves, Walter laughing at something a regular said, Marisol calling out an order, the new espresso machine hissing steam in a sound that no longer made Dylan's stomach drop every time he heard it. Lily had abandoned her coloring book in favor of standing on her crate, narrating something to Mrs. Alvarez with the full, uninhibited drama of a 6-year-old who'd found a captive audience. And the old woman was laughing in a way that made her look 10 years younger. It struck Dylan, watching all of it through the front window, that nothing about this moment had come easy. None of it had been smooth or simple or fair along the way. A man had been publicly humiliated in front of his own daughter. A small business had nearly been gutted by greed dressed up as good business sense. An old man had spent 2 years quietly believing he was failing at the one thing he'd built his entire life around. The world hadn't bent itself kindly toward any of them. They'd had to fight for it, piece by piece, footage frame by footage frame, in a back office that barely fit 2 chairs. But it had worked out. Not because anyone had been perfect. Dylan knew his own temper had nearly broken loose more than once during all of this. Knew Vivian had spent 18 months not asking the hard questions she should have asked from day one. Knew Walter had let pride keep him quiet about how bad things had gotten for far longer than he should have. It had worked out because, somewhere along the way, enough people had chosen to look a little closer instead of looking away. And that had been enough. Maybe that was the whole lesson in it, if a person was looking for one. Power didn't have to mean cruelty. Having less didn't have to mean you had nothing worth protecting. And the loudest, most certain voice in a room, the one with the clipboard, the one with the tablet, the one announcing your failures to a room full of strangers, wasn't always the one telling the truth. Sometimes the truth was quieter than that. Sometimes it was just a man crouched down at his daughter's eye level, choosing comfort over a fight he could have won on points and lost on everything that actually mattered. 1 month later, the cafe had settled into its new rhythm the way a body settles after healing. A little different than before, but stronger in the places that had broken. Walter had started talking quietly about cutting back his hours, finally, after 4 decades, trusting Dylan to run the floor the way he always had, except now without the constant low hum of dread underneath it. Vivian came by most Tuesdays, the day she'd started blocking off specifically for her new community advisory work, which mostly meant sitting in the corner booth with Dylan going over case files for 2 other small businesses. Ashford Holdings was reassessing properly this time, with actual care instead of clipboards. Lily had taken to calling those afternoons Vivian Day, which neither adult had the heart to correct, mostly because neither of them particularly wanted to. On one of those Tuesdays, late in the afternoon with the cafe mostly empty, Lily climbed up onto the booth beside Vivian without asking, the way she'd started doing more and more, and held up a fresh drawing. The same 3 figures as before, but this time with a 4th shape beside them, smaller, with a tail. "That's the cat bear," Lily explained before anyone could ask. "He lives with us now. In the drawing, I mean. We don't actually have a cat."
Do you want one? Vivian asked. Lily's eyes went enormous. Can we? Lily. Dylan shot Vivian a look across the table, somewhere between amused and exasperated. You're not allowed to bribe my kid into liking you more. She already likes you plenty. I'm not bribing anyone. I just asked a question. Vivian's mouth twitched, fighting a smile. Though, for the record, I happen to know a shelter 2 blocks from my building that's currently overrun with kittens. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. But Dylan was smiling too, the kind of smile that came easy now in a way it hadn't. A few months back, before all of this, before a billionaire walked through his front door expecting to find a failure and found something else instead, Lily, satisfied that the cat question had at least been opened for negotiation, went back to her drawing, adding details with the fierce concentration only small children could summon, humming something tuneless under her breath. Dylan watched her for a moment, then looked back at Vivian, at the woman who'd shown up that first terrible morning in a coat that cost more than his rent, ready by every appearance, to be exactly the kind of person who tore lives apart without a second thought, and had instead chosen, again and again, in a dozen small, unglamorous moments, nobody would ever put in a headline, to look closer and do better. Thank you, he said, quiet enough that Lily didn't look up from her crayons. For all of it, not just the loan or the renovation, for actually seeing what was here before you decided what to do about it. You're the one who showed it to me, Vivian said. I just had to be willing to look. Outside, the afternoon light slanted gold through the front window, catching the restored mural on the back wall, the garden, the vines curling patient and unhurried around the wooden gate, painted by a woman 20 years gone and loved enough by the people left behind to be carefully, deliberately preserved instead of erased. The espresso machine hissed steam, steady and unremarkable now, just a machine doing its job the way it was supposed to. Marisol laughed at something near the register. Walter's cane tapped slow and familiar against the tile as he made his way to his usual chair by the door, content, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, to simply sit and watch the place he'd built still standing, still breathing, still exactly, stubbornly itself. And in the corner booth, a billionaire, who'd once been ready to sign off on its destruction, sat coloring a kitten into a 6-year-old's drawing, while a single father who'd built his whole life out of quiet, unglamorous kindness watched the 2 people he loved most laugh over something neither of them would ever fully explain to him, and understood without needing it spelled out, that whatever this was, family, friendship, something still finding its name, it had been built the same way the cafe itself had survived everything thrown at it. Not with power, not with money, though the money had certainly helped once it finally landed in the right hands. It had been built the slow way, the honest way. One small, unremarked act of decency at a time, repeated long enough and steady enough that eventually, even the people who'd never thought to look twice couldn't help but notice it was there.